The jump brought them out wrong. Marin felt it before the instruments confirmed it. A wrongness in her sternum. The kind that happens when the body registers something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. The star field through the viewport was unfamiliar. Not just unfamiliar, wrong in a specific, irreversible way, the way a door looks wrong when it swings on the wrong hinge. "Constrictors offline," Dak said from the nav console, not looking up. His voice had the flat, careful quality of someone who knows the next sentence is going to be bad. "We've been running at something north of 40x for the last 7 minutes. The routing protocols are fried." Marin didn't ask how. She already knew. She'd agreed to it. The transit to Cressida Station was supposed to take 4 days at the licensed limit, and the crew had been restless and loud about it. And she had let Dak pull the constrictor because 4 days was long, and because she was tired of being the one who made people wait. Now they were somewhere they weren't supposed to be. Behind her, the rest of the crew was filtering into the cockpit in the slow, hungover way of people shaken awake by vibration. Fen still holding a half-eaten meal bar. Tova and Rice side by side as always. Tova's hand on the back of Rice's shoulder without thinking about it. Cassia last, her dark eyes scanning the viewport and the instruments simultaneously, already calculating. "Beacon?" Marin asked. "Fried with the router," Dak said. "I can rebuild the transmitter array, but it'll take time." "How much time?" "I don't know yet." Fen finished his meal bar and said quietly, "Where are we?" Marin studied the nav display. The star cluster it was trying to match against the charts was unfamiliar. The system they'd stumbled into had 3 planets, 2 gas giants, and 1 rocky body in the habitable zone, none of them catalogued in the civilian registry. The military registry had its own partition she couldn't access without clearance. The rocky planet below had oxygen. It had water vapor in the spectrographic readout. It had, as far as the ship's sensors could tell, breathable air. "Down," she said. The landing was not graceful. The ship was rated for emergency atmospheric entry, but emergency entry and actual landing were 2 different propositions, and the tree canopy that rushed up at them in the last 200 meters was neither runways nor tarmac. The hull shrieked. Something in the aft compartment broke loose. They came down hard on a rocky shelf above a valley floor, tilting 15 degrees, and when Marin finally cut power to the struggling repulsors, the silence that followed felt enormous. Cassia had a broken finger. Rice had a gash above his ear that bled impressively but shallowly. Dak, who had been braced against the nav console and absorbed the worst of the deceleration jolt, moved his left arm carefully and then stopped moving it carefully and said nothing about it for the rest of the day. They stepped outside into air that smelled like iron and rain. The planet was green in the way that places with no people are green, deeply, unreasonably, with a quality of thickness to the foliage that suggested it had never been edited by anything with preferences. The valley below them was a mat of canopy interrupted by pale standing stones. Above, the sky was a washed-out violet blue that Marin couldn't stop looking at, a color that had no name in any language she knew. "It's beautiful," Tova said softly, and she meant it. "Don't touch anything," Marin said. She put Dak on the transmitter with Cassia assisting, because Dak was the better engineer, but Cassia had 2 working hands. She took Fen and Tova and Rice into the woods to look for fresh water and assess the terrain. The plan was simple: repair the beacon, signal for extraction, stay out of trouble for however long that took. The plan lasted about 4 hours. Fen found the tracks first. He was the kind of person who looked at the ground when he walked rather than ahead, which Marin had always found mildly irritating and which now felt like a gift. He stopped and crouched and didn't say anything, and Marin came up beside him and looked at what he was looking at. The impressions in the soft earth were large. Not large the way a large animal is large, but large in a different way. Too many of them, too close together, as if whatever made them moved on something more than 4 limbs. The depth was inconsistent in a specific way that suggested weight distribution across multiple contact points. A body plan that didn't map to anything in the standard xenobiological surveys Marin had read during training, which admittedly she had not read with great attention. "Back to the ship," she said. She said it quietly, and without emphasis, and the others moved without arguing, which was how she knew they had seen it too. The quality of wrongness, the door on the wrong hinge. Halfway back to the ship they heard it. It came from above and to the left, a sound like wet cloth being torn, rhythmic and deliberate. And Marin looked up and saw something on the cliff face that she spent the rest of that day trying to describe to herself in useful terms and could not. It was large. It moved with a fluidity that suggested the bones, if there were bones, were organized differently than she expected. Its coloration was the same pale stone gray as the cliff, and the reason she could see it at all was not because of contrast but because of movement. It had turned to look at them. Not like an animal looks at you. Like something evaluates a threat. "Don't run," she said. They didn't run. They walked backward at a pace that was technically not running, but communicated the same information. The thing on the cliff watched them go. When they reached the ship and sealed the hatch, Marin stood with her back against the inner bulkhead and listened to the sound of her own breathing until it steadied. "There are others," Rice said, from the narrow porthole. "At least 3 more on the ridge. They've been there a while, I think, the way they're positioned." Marin came to the porthole. He was right. The ridge above the landing shelf held 3 shapes that had been there the whole time she'd been standing outside, and she hadn't seen them because they matched the rock, because they wanted to be seen only when it served them. "Cassia," she said. "Beacon. 6 hours, maybe 8, Cassia said. Marin looked at the ridge. Faster. The night came quickly. The sun, smaller and redder than Earth standard, dropped behind the western canopy and took the light with it faster than any planet Marin had grown up on. Dak and Cassia worked by the glow of portable lamps inside the ship. Marin sat at the porthole and watched the dark. She was still watching when the flares went up. They came from the east, 3 quick pulses of cold white light arcing over the tree line, and in the fraction of a second each flare hung at its apex. Marin saw things she had to process in sequence, because there were too many of them to absorb at once. She saw the aliens, many of them, a dozen at least, moving through the valley floor in a loose formation that was not the movement of animals, but of something that coordinated. And she saw, positioned on a ridge to the east, shapes that were unmistakably human, armed, armored, and not there by accident. The firefight was brief and catastrophic. She heard the weapons before she understood what she was hearing. A sound like the air being torn open repeatedly, the crack of directed energy discharge. And under it, a sound she had never heard before and immediately hated, the screaming of the aliens, which was a frequency that landed in the chest rather than the ears. She watched 3 of the creatures fall. She watched the armored shapes advance in a skirmish line, the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before. And she watched them turn and fire twice into the trees to the south, where Fen and Tova had slipped out an hour ago to check the water source. The silence after was the kind that takes up residence. Marin was out the hatch before she decided to be out the hatch. She heard Rice behind her and didn't tell him to go back because there was no point. The woods swallowed them. She moved by feel and by the faint residual light of the cooling flare discharge, working south toward where she'd last seen the muzzle flash. She found Tova first, alive, crouched behind a deadfall, her hand pressed to her forearm, where something had grazed her. Not the weapon that had fired into the trees, but something else. A claw or a branch. She couldn't tell in the dark. Fen was 10 meters away, face down, not moving. Marin knelt by him. She found a pulse. She looked up and there was a soldier standing 6 meters away, with a weapon pointed at her, and behind the helmet visor she could not read anything. And the silence between them was the kind that exists at the edge of decisions. "He's alive," she said. "I'm not armed. We're civilians. We crashed here. We don't know anything." The soldier did not lower the weapon. "The beacon," she said. "We have a repair underway. We'll be gone in 6 hours. You'll never hear from us." The soldier said nothing. But they didn't fire. What happened next happened fast. One of the creatures came out of the undergrowth to Marin's left, moving low and fast and entirely, without the hesitating quality it had shown earlier on the cliff. And the soldier fired and missed. And in the confusion Marin grabbed Fen's collar and dragged him backward, and Rice took his legs and they moved, crashing through undergrowth that caught at their arms and faces, moving away from both the soldier and the creature, and anything else that wanted them dead. They found the ship by luck and by the smell of the overheated hull metal, which had a specific burnt quality Marin associated with emergency landings, and now would for the rest of her life. Cassia met them at the hatch. Her eyes went to Fen. "He's breathing," Marin said. "Concussion maybe. We get inside and we do not open this hatch again until the beacon is working." "It is working," Cassia said. Marin stopped. "Got the array online 12 minutes ago. Signal's out. Someone should be reading it. How long for response if there's a relay in this system? Minutes if not." Cassia's jaw tightened. "Days." Marin looked at the ridge. She could see lights up there now. Not flares. Steady lights, tactical, the kind of illumination that comes with planning. They were moving, east to west, working a grid. Looking for survivors. Not the alien survivors. "Wake Dak," she said. "I don't care how much his arm hurts. We need to talk. They sat in a ring in the main cabin with the emergency lighting on its lowest setting, and Marin told them what she'd seen and what she'd inferred. And when she finished, nobody said anything for a moment. Fen spoke first. He had a knot on his temple the size of a thumb joint, and his voice was rougher than usual. The creatures. You said they weren't. They weren't acting like animals. The soldiers are trying to wipe them out. That's what it looked like. And they'll wipe us out to keep it quiet, Marin said. That's what it looked like. Tova had her eyes closed. Not the closed eyes of sleep, but the closed eyes of someone running calculations. If we can get to their command position. We're not getting to their command position, Rice said. If we can get to it, we can broadcast on their frequency. Whatever they're transmitting up to their orbital asset, we can piggyback our own signal on it. Authentication won't matter because we're not trying to talk to them. We're trying to talk past them. To whoever's listening on the civilian band. Our beacon might not reach anything in this system. Their relay definitely does. Silence. That's either the worst idea or the best idea I've heard today, Dak said. It's the only idea, Tova said. The command position was 300 meters east, up the ridge, and they knew this because Rice had been watching the lights move and tracking where they converged and where they didn't, which was the same skill he'd developed as a child, navigating his aunt's farm at night, and which he'd never expected to use for anything more serious than getting from the barn to the house without waking the dogs. They didn't all go. Fen stayed. He was ambulatory, but there was something wrong with his equilibrium, and the terrain wouldn't forgive it. Cassia stayed with him, both because she was the better medic and because if everything went wrong, they needed someone at the ship who knew the transmitter. Dax stayed because Marin told him to, and he didn't argue, which told her his arm was worse than he'd let on. That left Marin, Rice, and Tova. They went up the ridge in single file, Rice leading because he knew the footfalls, moving low through brush that scraped their arms and left cold dew on their faces. The sky above had darkened to a proper night, the stars here unfamiliar and thickly scattered, no constellation Marin could name looking down at her. She found that steadying in a way she couldn't explain. The stars didn't know where they were either. The command position was not what she expected. She had expected something improvised, a field command, a temporary installation. What she found was the opposite. The equipment was embedded. The sensor array was anchored in the rock of the ridge in a way that suggested months of work, maybe longer. This was not a patrol that had stumbled across the planet. This was a long-term operation, planned and resourced and specifically intended to look like nothing from orbit. There were 4 soldiers at the position, 2 running the consoles, 1 at the perimeter looking out, 1 unaccounted for. She was still calculating when she heard a footstep behind her. She turned into the barrel of a weapon held by the 4th soldier, who had come around from the other side of the ridge, and found her precisely the way she'd been afraid someone would. And for the second time that night, she stood with a gun on her in the dark and thought about how to use the only resource she still had, which was words. I need to use your uplink, she said. The soldier said, kneel down. I need to use your uplink and then we'll go, all of us. We have a beacon running. Your EVAC commander knows about us already. He's going to have us killed before we can get off planet because we've seen what you're doing here. Using your uplink is the only thing that changes that math. If I can talk to someone outside this system, your commander loses the option. The soldier said, you don't know what you're talking about. I know what I saw in the valley. A pause. I know what those creatures are, Marin said. I've seen xenobiological surveys. I've seen the movement, the coordination, the scouting behavior. They are not animals. They are indigenous. And you have been killing them for. She looked at the embedded equipment. At least a year. Maybe more. Whoever authorized this, whoever's paying for it, they want this world cleared, and they need no witnesses. Kneel down, the soldier said again, but quieter. My name is Marin Voss. I'm a cargo pilot, commercial license, no military affiliation. I have 4 crew members. One of them is 19 years old. Tell me you are going to put a round through a 19-year-old civilian to keep a real estate project from going public. The soldier didn't say anything. From somewhere below and to the left there was a sound. The alien screaming. That chest frequency wrongness, and it was close, much closer than before. The soldier flinched. A microscopic movement, the barrel tracking slightly. In the trees behind the command position, the shadows moved in a way that shadows should not move. Marin said, they're not coming for us. The soldier looked at her. They've been watching us since we landed. We walked past 3 of them in the trees, and they didn't touch us. They knew what we were. Something that isn't you. She kept her voice flat. They can distinguish. The alien's screaming rose again, not in aggression but in a register that Marin had been unconsciously cataloging all night, and which she was now allowing herself to consciously recognize. It was a frequency that meant something. She didn't know what. She knew it wasn't random. The soldier lowered the weapon by 3 centimeters. Not all the way. 3 centimeters. The uplink, Marin said. She didn't wait for permission. She walked past him to the console, and he didn't stop her. And she thought about what that meant, about what kind of person was in that armor, and whether there were more of them or fewer of them than she needed. The uplink was standard EVS military issue, the same generation as the equipment she'd trained on during the 1 year she'd spent in the Reserve Corps before switching to commercial cargo. She knew the authentication architecture. She knew which part of the architecture was checksum verified and which part relied on frequency alignment rather than identity. She found the civilian band relay path the way you find something in a dark room, by knowing the shape of the space well enough to navigate without seeing. Reese materialized at her shoulder. She didn't ask how he'd gotten there. 30 seconds, she said. 19, he said, which was his way of telling her she was being optimistic. She got it on the 14th second. The signal went out on the civilian emergency band, riding the military relay like a passenger on a ship that didn't know it had a passenger, bouncing off the EVS orbital asset and out into the system, and, if the relay geometry was what she thought it was, out of the system entirely on the standard navigation beacon net. Name, ship registry, system coordinates from the nav display she'd memorized when it still had power, the word genocide. Because she had thought carefully during the walk up the ridge about which word would make someone who received this signal stop what they were doing, and that was the word she had arrived at. She said it twice, 32 seconds total. She straightened and turned, and the 4 command position soldiers were all looking at her, and 2 of them had weapons up. And the one who had found her in the dark still had his weapon not entirely raised. And from the valley below, the sound of the creatures rose in something that Marin would later describe in the deposition as coordinated, like they knew. The soldier with the lowered weapon turned to the one who appeared to be in charge and said, in a voice that carried very little inflection, "They've transmitted. I heard. Commander's going to. I know what the commander's going to do." Silence on the ridge. "All I'm saying," the soldier said, "is that there's a transmission log now. EVS authentication system logged civilian use of the military uplink. There's a record. Whatever happens down here, there's a record." He paused. "I signed up to clear colonization obstacles. That's what they told me. I didn't." He stopped. "Nobody told any of us what it was," another soldier said. From behind the visor you couldn't read the expression, only the voice, and the voice had a quality Marin recognized. The quality of someone who has been moving toward a decision for a long time and has just arrived. What happened next she would tell differently to different people in the years after, because the truth of it resisted single versions. The 2 soldiers with raised weapons lowered them. The commander's voice came over their comms, ordering an immediate termination sweep of the ridge. The soldier who had found her in the dark looked at Marin with an expression she couldn't see, and said, through the helmet speaker, in a voice that was entirely without theatrical emphasis, "Get off this ridge." They got off the ridge. The descent was faster than the ascent because fear changes the body's relationship with footing. Rice fell twice and got up twice. Tova caught a branch across the face and ignored it. Marin's left knee, which had been giving her trouble since the landing, informed her at the worst possible time that it had more to say about the subject, and she ignored it too. They hit the flat of the landing shelf at a run. Cassia had the hatch open. Behind it, Fen was sitting up and looked better than he had any right to. Dak had an improvised splint on his forearm that Marin suspected he'd put there in the last hour without telling anyone. "We're leaving," Marin said. "Right now." "Ship's not rated for," Dak started. "Right now, Dak." He went to the cockpit. The ship's engines, which were not in good condition, made a sound when they lit that Marin found personally upsetting. A grinding hesitation followed by a note that suggested they were operating on something other than full faith. She stood behind Dak's seat and watched the instruments and did not look at the ridge where lights were now moving fast down toward the shelf. The repulsors caught. The ship lifted. Through the viewport, the planet fell away below them. The violet-blue sky, the thick canopy, the pale standing stones in the valley. And on the ridge, in the gray pre-dawn light that was just beginning to separate the sky from the trees, she could see them. Not the soldiers. The creatures, spread along the ridgeline, in a line that looked like nothing so much as people watching a departure. She watched them until the atmosphere thinned, and the sky darkened, and they were gone. The relay station at the edge of the system picked up her signal 11 hours later. 43 hours after that, an independent Commerce Authority vessel emerged from jump and began broadcasting on the military emergency frequency, which was an extremely pointed way of announcing that they knew what was in this system. The EVS contingent on the planet was gone before the ICA could land an inspection team. Because that's what happens when people with resources have 43 hours of warning. The equipment on the rid had been cleared. The installation that had taken months to build had been sanitized in less than 2 days, with a thoroughness that suggested considerable practice. What they couldn't clear was the transmission log. The authentication system had done its job. There was a record. There was also Marin's deposition, and Rice's, and Tova's. There were the xenobiological assessments that followed the ICA's initial investigation, which took 4 months and required 3 additional specialists to complete, and which used terms like emergent social organization and pre-symbolic communication and, carefully, in footnotes that would nonetheless be quoted extensively in the subsequent legal proceedings, the word sapient. There was the soldier who had lowered his weapon, who had filed his own deposition from a location the EVS never found. Marin was called to testify twice. The first time, the proceedings were classified and she was not permitted to describe them. The second time, they were public, and she did. She flew cargo for 6 more years after that. The knee held up. She thought about the ridge sometimes, about the line of watchers in the dawn light, about what it means to be seen by something that could have killed you and chose not to. She thought about the frequency of their screaming, which she still heard sometimes in that register between the ears and the chest, the one that means something she would spend a long time learning. The ICA survey team that went back to the planet 2 years after the initial investigation found the creatures, found the people, had not gone anywhere. They were exactly where they had been. They had been there, the xenobiologist estimated from a study of the landscape changes and the ancient stone formations in the valley, for approximately 40,000 years. They were waiting. Not for rescue. They had been there longer than the concept of rescue required a starship. They were waiting in the way things wait when they understand that time is not an emergency. The first deliberate communication happened in the valley at the Standing Stones, through a process that the ECA linguist on site later described as one of the most methodical and patient exchanges she had ever witnessed. One of the creatures, one of the people, placed a stone on a flat rock surface, then arranged them in a pattern and looked at the linguist and waited. The linguist placed a stone. What followed took 2 years of daily sessions in the valley and produced a vocabulary of 400 shared concepts, which the linguist noted was considerably faster than her projections, and which she attributed not to any method or technology, but to the quality of the attention on the other side of the exchange. They were extraordinary listeners. They had been watching humans for the full duration of the EVS operation, watching soldiers, watching the killing, watching Marin's crew land and stumble and survive. And they had learned a great deal about what humans were before humans ever thought to ask what they were. The question they eventually figured out how to ask, in the slow, patient vocabulary of stones and gestures and returning sounds, took the linguist 3 months to be sure she was reading correctly, because it was not the question she had expected. She had expected something about the killing, or about the soldiers, or about whether more ships were coming. What they asked was, "Why did you come back?" The linguist wrote about this in the paper that would eventually be cited in the legal brief that changed the classification of the planet from unclaimed territory to protected world. She wrote that she had not known how to answer the question at first because the honest answer was complicated, involving bureaucratic processes and transmission logs, and a deposition given by a cargo pilot with a bad knee. She wrote that she had eventually answered in the only vocabulary she had, by placing a stone and waiting, and by coming back the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. She wrote that she thought they understood. Marin read the paper on a long transit 3 years after her second testimony, somewhere between Cressida Station and a refinery platform in the outer belt. She read it twice. She looked out the viewport at the starfield, which was the familiar one she'd grown up under. Constellations with names she'd learned as a child. She thought about the soldier on the ridge, who had lowered his weapon, who had said, into a comm he knew was being monitored by his commanding officer, "There's a record." who had apparently decided, somewhere on the slope of that alien ridge in the dark, that the record mattered more than what came after. She thought about what it is that humans carry into the dark. Not just weapons, not just ships. The capacity for the specific kind of betrayal that goes the other way. That turns the weapon around. That says this is not what I signed up for. That lowers the barrel by 3 centimeters and then 3 more. The cargo hold beneath her had 17,000 kilograms of processed grain bound for a colony station that needed it. She had been flying this route for 3 years. She would fly it for 3 more probably. The work was not glorious. The knee still complained on long transits. She found, when she thought about the ridge, that she didn't regret anything she'd done there. Not the transmission, not the words she'd said to the soldier, not the choice to walk past him to the console. What she regretted was the time before the crash. The impatience, the constrictor being pulled, the agreement she'd made because waiting was inconvenient. She had ended up exactly where she was supposed to go, just not the way she'd planned. Outside the viewport, the stars were the familiar ones. She knew their names. She said a few of them out loud, in the dark of the cockpit, to no one. It was a habit she'd developed in the years since the ridge. A small ritual, the kind of small human texture that doesn't mean anything to anyone watching, but means something to the person doing it. She had learned from the people on the ridge who were still there after 40,000 years. That meaning doesn't require an audience. It just requires returning, day after day, stone by stone. The transit took 4 more hours. She flew it straight.